The red-eye flight from San Francisco to New York moved through the dark like a quiet thought cabin lights dimmed to a warm amber that softened faces and blurred the line between strangers. In the front cabin, most passengers were already half asleep. Heads tilted, laptops closed, lives temporarily paused. Daniel Brooks sat upright in his seat, his shoulders relaxed but alert, as if rest were a luxury he had learned not to expect. He wore a faded gray hoodie and worn sneakers, the uniform of practicality rather than status. Beside him, his 8-year-old daughter Emily leaned against his arm, clutching a small sketchbook filled with uneven drawings of airplanes and clouds. She whispered questions in the hushed cabin, her curiosity gentle but persistent and the kind that came from wonder rather than mischief. Daniel answered each one softly, lowering his voice instinctively, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness around them. 3 rows ahead sat Victoria Reynolds, 33 years old, founder and CEO of a fast-rising tech company whose valuation had crossed $1 billion before her 32nd birthday. Her white blazer was perfectly pressed despite the long day, her platinum watch catching the dim cabin light each time she checked the time. Tomorrow morning, a merger presentation awaited her in Manhattan, a single meeting that could secure her legacy or unravel years of relentless ambition. Sleep was not optional. It was a necessity. Every quiet sound mattered, every whisper grated against her nerves like static in a critical signal. When Emily asked another question, soft, curious, innocent Victoria's jaw tightened. She turned slightly in her seat, irritation sharpening her expression as she glanced back toward the source of the disturbance, already forming a judgment before a word was spoken. "Could you please keep your daughter quiet?" Victoria said, her voice controlled but unmistakably authoritative. "Some of us have important work tomorrow." The words were not loud, but they carried weight, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Daniel looked up surprised, but composed, and offered a brief, sincere apology. He gently pulled a thin blanket over Emily's shoulders, leaning closer to her ear and whispering reassurance. Emily nodded, trying her best to be still, though her eyes remained wide with curiosity. Daniel did not argue, did not explain, did not defend himself. His calm only seemed to sharpen Victoria's irritation. Her gaze drifted over his clothes, the scuffed shoes, the backpack at his feet, assembling a story that fit neatly into her worldview. People like him, she thought, did not belong here. "Maybe next time you could consider booking a family section." She added a polite smile, masking the dismissal beneath it. Daniel met her eyes briefly, not with anger or embarrassment, but with a steady neutrality that made her look away first. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, quickly shaping it, with practiced precision, into a small airplane. He handed it to Emily, who instantly fell silent, studying the clean lines and sharp angles with fascination. The plane was balanced, deliberate, nothing like the sloppy folds of a child's toy. Daniel watched her for a moment, making sure she was settled, and then leaned back in his seat, his attention returning to the quiet rhythm of the flight. There was no resentment in his posture, no wounded pride, only patience. Victoria turned back to her laptop, but something unsettled lingered beneath her irritation. The man had not reacted the way she expected. There was no defensiveness, no apology wrapped in insecurity, no attempt to justify his presence. He had simply solved the problem and moved on. She shook the thought away, refocusing on spreadsheets and forecasts, reminding herself that appearances rarely lied. Outside the window, the vast darkness stretched endlessly, the aircraft cruising smoothly above the world below. In the quiet cabin, assumptions settled into place, unnoticed and unquestioned, as hundreds of lives moved forward together through the night, unaware of how violently those assumptions would soon be torn apart. Daniel Brooks had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. Years of moving through crowded terminals, budget hotels, and quiet neighborhoods had taught him that most people saw only what they expected to see. A man in a hoodie with a child at his side fit a familiar, comfortable narrative, and Daniel did nothing to challenge it. As the aircraft leveled off, he rested his head back and listened not casually, but with a focus so subtle it looked like fatigue. To anyone watching, he was just another exhausted father on a late-night flight. To Daniel, every sound mattered. The steady hum of the engines, the faint vibration through the seat frame, the cadence of airflow over the wings, these were not background noise. They were information. Emily traced the outline of the paper airplane with her finger, her whisper barely audible. "Daddy, why does this one look different from the ones at school?" Daniel smiled faintly and leaned closer, lowering his voice even more. He explained weight distribution balance, how even a millimeter could change the way air moved across the wings. His words were simple, chosen carefully, so an 8-year-old could understand. But the precision beneath them was unmistakable. Emily nodded seriously, absorbing every detail as if it were a secret meant only for her. She had grown up believing that her father knew how things worked, not because he claimed authority, but because he never guessed. He always knew. Across the aisle, a few passengers shifted in their seats, settling in for sleep. The cabin felt suspended in a fragile peace, the kind that exists only when nothing has gone wrong yet. Daniel glanced at the overhead panel, at the safety card tucked into the seat pocket, at the faint reflections in the window. He had flown enough to know that routine bred complacency, and complacency was the enemy of survival. Still, there was no tension in his movements, no sign of anticipation. He had learned to wait without appearing to wait to observe, without drawing attention. Emily yawned, finally lulled into silence by the steady flight and the comfort of her father's presence. 3 rows ahead, Victoria Reynolds closed her laptop and exhaled sharply. The numbers blurred together, refusing to settle into certainty. She prided herself on control, on preparation, on eliminating variables before they became threats. That was how she had built her company, how she had survived boardrooms filled with people waiting for her to fail. Tonight, however, control felt thin, the delayed flight, the child behind her, the faint awareness that she could not command the sky the way she commanded a room. All of it gnawed at her patience. She glanced back once more, just long enough to confirm that the child was quiet and the problem resolved. The man's posture was relaxed, his attention fully on his daughter, as if nothing else existed. Victoria turned forward again, dismissing him from her mind. The first sign of trouble was subtle enough that most passengers missed it entirely. A slight change in vibration passed through the cabin floor, more felt than heard, like a rhythm slipping out of sync. Daniel's eyes opened immediately. His head tilted a fraction, his expression sharpening, as his mind cataloged the difference. The engine hum was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. A faint electrical scent drifted through the air, barely noticeable, easily dismissed as imagination. A few passengers wrinkled their noses, then shrugged it off. Flight attendants moved down the aisle with practiced smiles, unaware that anything had changed. Daniel's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the armrest. He listened again, isolating the sound, comparing it to memory. He had heard this before, not often, but enough to recognize the pattern. His gaze moved to the ceiling, then to the aisle, then back to Emily, who was now half asleep, her breathing slow and even. He adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, his movements calm and deliberate, as if nothing in the world were amiss. Panic, he knew, spread faster than fire in confined spaces. Control began with silence. Ahead of him, Victoria laughed softly at something on her screen, muttering under her breath about airline maintenance. The words carried no malice, only irritation, but Daniel did not look at her. His attention was fixed inward, running through possibilities, probabilities, contingencies. Whatever this was, it was not yet critical, but it was moving in that direction. Above them, invisible systems compensated, adjusted, struggled quietly to maintain equilibrium. The cabin remained calm, unaware that the thin margin between routine and disaster had just begun to close. The illusion of normalcy shattered without warning. A sudden jolt rippled through the aircraft, stronger than turbulence, sharp enough to pull gasps from sleeping passengers. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, leaving behind a silence so tense it felt heavy. Daniel's body reacted before thought had time to catch up. His spine straightened, senses fully awake, every sound snapping into focus. The vibration beneath his feet was no longer subtle. It carried urgency, a tremor that spoke of systems under strain. Around him, heads lifted, eyes, darted hands tightened around armrests as confusion spread through the cabin like a cold draft. Then the oxygen masks dropped. The metallic clatter echoed through the cabin, violent and unmistakable, sending a surge of panic through the passengers. Emily startled awake, her eyes wide with fear, as the mask swung in front of her face. Daniel moved, instantly pulling his own mask down and fitting it over her nose and mouth with practiced ease. "Breathe slowly," he whispered, his voice steady and close, cutting through the rising noise. "Just like we practiced." Emily nodded, clutching the elastic strap, her fear easing slightly as she followed his lead. Around them, passengers fumbled with masks, voices rising, the fragile calm dissolving into chaos. The intercom crackled to life, feedback, whining briefly, before a strained voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing a pressurization issue. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions." The pause that followed was too long, heavy, with unspoken fear. Then the voice returned, no longer steady, no longer rehearsed. "Is there any military pilot or fighter pilot on board this aircraft?" The question hung in the air, raw and desperate, stripping away any remaining illusion of control. Conversations died instantly. Even the crying seemed to fade as passengers exchanged stunned looks, the weight of the moment sinking in. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. This was the line he had hoped never to cross again, the boundary between past and present he had worked so hard to bury. He checked Emily one more time, adjusting her mask, meeting her gaze. "I need to help the pilots," he said gently. "You stay right here and listen to the flight attendants, okay?" Emily's eyes searched his, frightened but trusting. She nodded, gripping his sleeve for a moment before letting go. Daniel rose from his seat, slowly, deliberately, refusing to feed the panic around him. Every movement was controlled, measured as if the cabin itself were watching him for cues. Victoria Reynolds stared as the man in the hoodie stepped into the aisle. For a moment, her mind refused to reconcile the image with reality. This was the same man she had dismissed, the same quiet father she had judged unimportant. Yet the way he stood now was different. His posture was balanced, his gaze focused, his presence commanding without a single raised word. Flight attendants turned toward him, relief flashing across their faces as he spoke calmly, identifying himself and offering assistance. There was no bravado in his voice, no attempt to dominate the situation, only competence and certainty. As Daniel was escorted toward the cockpit, the cabin buzzed with hushed whispers and restrained fear. Victoria remained frozen in her seat, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear behind the partially open door. The sounds from the front of the aircraft were frantic raised voices, alarms, the sharp cadence of checklist calls overlapping in controlled chaos. Through the gap, she caught a glimpse of the cockpit warning lights glowing across the panels, smoke curling faintly near the ceiling, and the captain's face pale and drawn. And then, Daniel's voice cut through it, all low and steady, grounding the storm of noise like an anchor dropped into rough seas. Back in the cabin, time stretched unbearably thin. Passengers clutched masks and hands, eyes darting toward the front, searching for reassurance. Emily sat very still, holding the paper airplane against her chest like a talisman. Victoria found herself reaching out her hand, closing gently over the child's, offering comfort she did not fully understand herself. The aircraft began a slow descent, the angle unmistakable gravity pressing heavier into every seat. Somewhere between fear and hope, between altitude and earth, lives balanced on decisions being made behind a closed door, guided by a man no one had truly seen until now. The cockpit was filled with tension the moment Daniel Brooks stepped inside. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel, red and amber indicators blinking in rapid succession, each signaling a problem that demanded immediate attention. The captain's face was tight with strain, his fingers gripping the controls as he tried to keep pace with the cascading alerts. The first officer's hands moved quickly, but without rhythm, his breathing shallow, as stress threatened to overwhelm training. Into this fragile balance came Daniel, calm and deliberate, his presence alone, shifting the energy of the space. "I'm not certified to fly this aircraft," Daniel said clearly, as he took the jump seat, careful to respect the chain of command. "But I can assist with emergency procedures and checklists." There was no hesitation in his voice, no need to prove anything. The captain glanced at him and nodded, recognizing competence not as arrogance, but as steadiness. Daniel opened the quick reference handbook and began reading aloud, his voice even and controlled. Each instruction landed with purpose, cutting through the noise of alarms and anxious breathing. Confirm pressurization failure. Isolate affected electrical systems. Set oxygen flow to 100%. As the crew followed his guidance, the chaos began to organize itself. Smoke from the faulty panel thinned as systems were isolated, though new warnings appeared as backups engaged. Daniel did not rush. He filtered information calmly, prioritizing what mattered and ignoring what did not. "Recommend declaring pan-pan with air traffic control," he said, measured but firm. "Prepare to escalate to Mayday if conditions worsen." The captain relayed the call, his voice steadier now, bolstered by the quiet certainty beside him. Within moments, they were given vectors to the nearest suitable airport, emergency services already standing by. Outside the cockpit, the aircraft began its descent. The cabin felt heavier as altitude dropped, pressure building in passengers' ears. Fear lingered, but it no longer felt directionless. Victoria Reynolds sat rigidly in her seat, still holding Emily's hand. She listened to the subtle changes in engine tone and control surfaces, realizing that what she was hearing was not panic, but precision. For the first time, she understood that real leadership often happened far from view, without applause or authority. Back in the cockpit, Daniel leaned slightly toward the first officer. "Slow your breathing," he said quietly. "Check the horizon. We're stable." The younger pilot nodded, his shoulders relaxing as his hands found a steady rhythm again. Daniel did not take over. He supported, reinforcing confidence rather than replacing it. That distinction allowed the pilots to remain grounded in their roles, even as the margin for error narrowed. As runway lights appeared ahead, the cockpit grew focused and silent. Wind conditions were reviewed, descent rate adjusted, approach stabilized. Daniel offered a final suggestion, then fell quiet, trusting the crew to execute. The landing was firm, but controlled, the tires meeting the runway with a sharp, reassuring screech. Applause and sobs erupted throughout the cabin as emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Daniel unbuckled and stepped back into the aisle, already scanning for one person. Across the cabin, Emily clutched her paper airplane eyes locked on her father, waiting for him to come home to her seat. The moment the aircraft slowed to a stop, a wave of sound rushed through the cabin, applause breaking into sobs, strangers gripping one another, as if they had survived a shared storm. For many, the crisis ended the instant the wheels touched the ground. For Victoria Reynolds, it was only beginning. She remained seated, her hand still wrapped around Emily's, her pulse racing as reality settled in. The man she had dismissed hours earlier had just helped guide them out of a situation she had no language, for no framework to control. The certainty she carried so easily in boardrooms felt fragile now, stripped of its armor by fear and gratitude she did not know how to process. Emily finally let go of Victoria's hand and craned her neck toward the aisle, her eyes searching eagerly. When Daniel Brooks appeared walking calmly back toward his seat, as emergency lights flashed outside the windows, the child's face lit up with relief, so pure it caught in Victoria's chest. Daniel knelt beside his daughter, checking her mask, smoothing her hair, speaking softly as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. There was no victory in his expression, no need to be seen. He had stepped forward because it was necessary, and now he had stepped back just as naturally. Watching him, Victoria felt something shift inside her, a quiet dismantling of assumptions she had never questioned. Around them, flight attendants moved efficiently, guiding passengers through instructions, their voices steady again. The captain emerged briefly from the cockpit, his posture still stiff, but his eyes clear, scanning the cabin with visible relief. He stopped near Daniel, offered a firm handshake that looked more like a salute, and said something quietly that Victoria could not hear. Whatever the words were, Daniel accepted them with a nod, his focus returning immediately to Emily. It struck Victoria then how little he seemed to need acknowledgement. The approval of the room, the gratitude of strangers, the significance of what he had done, all of it appeared secondary to the simple fact that his daughter was safe. As passengers began to gather their belongings, the air felt different, charged not with panic, but with reflection. Conversations were hushed, thoughtful. People looked at one another longer, as if seeing each other for the first time. Victoria remained seated, her laptop untouched in her bag. The merger presentation that had dominated her thoughts all evening felt distant, oddly small. She realized with a jolt that she could not remember the last time something outside her own ambition had rearranged her priorities so completely. She stood slowly and approached Daniel, uncertainty tightening her throat. The words she had rehearsed in her mind dissolved as soon as she reached him. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, her voice low and unguarded. "I was wrong about you." Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze without judgment, without satisfaction. "Everyone did their part," he replied simply. "That's how things work when they work." There was no bitterness in his tone, no reminder of how she had spoken to him earlier. If anything, his restraint made the apology feel heavier, more deserved. Victoria nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She glanced at Emily, at the paper airplane still clutched in the child's hand, the crayon words, faint but legible. Something about that small object, a child's faith folded into fragile wings, felt more powerful than any contract she had ever signed. As emergency crews prepared to escort the passengers off the aircraft, Victoria understood that she had been given something rare, a moment that demanded she choose what kind of leader, what kind of person she would be when the ground stopped shaking. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their red and blue lights washing across the cabin windows in rhythmic flashes as the doors were opened and cool night air rushed inside. Passengers filed out slowly, some still shaken, others quietly grateful, all carrying the weight of how close they had come to something far worse. Daniel Brooks moved with Emily at his side, his hand steady on her shoulder, guiding her down the aisle, as if this were just another delayed flight, rather than an emergency landing that would dominate headlines by morning. He kept his eyes forward, intent on getting his daughter through the chaos without fear. They had barely stepped onto the jet bridge when a fire department supervisor froze mid-stride, his expression shifting from routine focus to stunned recognition. He straightened, instinctively posture snapping into something formal and precise. "Major Brooks," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief and respect. The sound of the name cut through the noise like a blade. Daniel stopped, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before settling back into composure. "That's not necessary," he replied quietly, glancing down at Emily, who looked up at the men with wide, curious eyes. But the moment had already begun to unravel. Other responders drew closer, murmurs spreading as fragments of recognition passed between them. One of the firefighters stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "I served under you during the Kandahar rotations," he said. "You brought our squadron home when the weather turned and everything else failed." An elderly passenger, still pale but steady on his feet, pushed gently through the crowd, tears streaking his face. "You led the formation out of that sandstorm in '09, he said, gripping Daniel's hand. "I never forgot." The stories layered over one another, each confirmation peeling away the quiet anonymity Daniel had built so carefully. Victoria Reynolds stood a few steps back, frozen, watching the scene assemble itself in real time. The man she had dismissed as insignificant now stood at the center of a growing circle of respect, his past rising to meet him, whether he wanted it to or not. The realization hit her with physical force. She had not just misjudged him, she had overlooked a life defined by service discipline and sacrifice. The weight of that blindness settled heavily in her chest, reshaping her understanding of what competence and worth truly looked like. Cameras appeared almost immediately, reporters drawn by emergency scanners and whispered confirmations. Microphones were raised, questions, shouted, lenses trained on Daniel, as if he were a discovery rather than a man trying to shield his child. Daniel reacted instantly, stepping in front of Emily, one arm extending protectively. "Please," he said firmly, his voice carrying authority without aggression. "Leave my daughter out of this." The crowd hesitated, the force of his presence cutting through the frenzy more effectively than any shouted order. The captain emerged moments later, fatigue etched into his features. He walked directly to Daniel and offered his hand, holding it with both of his own. "You kept us together up there," he said quietly. "You didn't just help us land the plane. You helped us remember how to fly." Daniel nodded once, accepting the words without ceremony, then turned his attention back to Emily, crouching to her level and smoothing her hair. In that small, deliberate gesture, Victoria saw the truth crystallize the man. Everyone was praising had never been chasing recognition. He had only ever been trying to bring people home safely, starting with the one person who mattered most. The airport terminal buzzed with activity as the immediate crisis gave way to logistics announcements and carefully managed calm. Airline representatives moved through the crowd with tablets and practiced efficiency, arranging hotel rooms, rebooking connections, offering apologies that sounded rehearsed but sincere enough. For most passengers, the night would end in exhaustion and fragmented sleep, and the memory of fear slowly dulling by morning. For Victoria Reynolds, however, time felt strangely suspended. She stood near the gate, watching Daniel Brooks help Emily adjust her backpack. His movements unhurried, his attention completely fixed on the small, ordinary needs of his daughter. Her phone vibrated in her hand, pulling her reluctantly back into the world she knew best. Messages stacked rapidly across the screen board, members, legal advisors, senior executives. The merger meeting had been moved up to accommodate the delay concerns, multiplying with every passing minute. Years ago, she would have responded instantly, issuing instructions, recalculating timelines, asserting control. Tonight, the device felt heavier than it should have, like a reminder of priorities she was no longer sure she believed in. She looked from the screen back to Daniel and Emily, and the contrast struck her with painful clarity. While she had been obsessing over billion-dollar outcomes, this man had been focused on getting his child home for a kindergarten graduation. A representative from her company approached, voice low but urgent, outlining contingencies, asking for direction. Victoria listened, nodded once, then surprised them both. "Cancel the meeting," she said quietly. "Reschedule everything." The words felt radical and yet unmistakably right. The representative hesitated, reminding her of the stakes, the expectations, the market response. Victoria met his gaze, her tone firm but calm. "People come before profits," she said. "That's not negotiable." For the first time in years, she did not feel fear after making a decision. She felt relief. She approached Daniel slowly, aware that every step carried weight. Reporters lingered at the edges of the terminal waiting for a statement, a quote, a narrative they could package neatly. Daniel avoided them with practiced ease, positioning himself so Emily remained shielded from attention. When Victoria reached him, he looked up polite but guarded, as if expecting another transaction, another demand. Instead, she spoke simply. "I was wrong," she said. "Not just earlier tonight. I was wrong about what matters." The apology was not dramatic, not public. It was private, direct, and unadorned. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "A lot of people are wrong about a lot of things," he replied evenly. "It doesn't have to define them." There was no forgiveness ceremony, no absolution granted or denied. There was only acknowledgement, and in that, something settled between them. Victoria realized then that true humility did not require humiliation. It required listening. As the crowd thinned and the terminal quieted, Victoria made another decision, this one even more surprising to herself. She instructed her assistant to arrange a hotel room for Daniel and Emily, anonymous, no publicity, no corporate branding attached. "They need rest," she said. "Nothing else?" When her assistant questioned whether it was appropriate, she answered without hesitation. "It's necessary." The certainty in her voice silenced further objections. Later, as the night stretched on and exhaustion finally claimed its due, Victoria found herself sitting beside Emily at a quiet corner table. The child was showing a flight attendant her paper airplanes, explaining with solemn pride how each fold mattered. Victoria listened, folding her own piece of paper under Emily's patient guidance. The plane she produced was imperfect, lopsided, but Emily clapped anyway, declaring it beautiful. In that moment, Victoria felt something loosen inside her chest, a tightness she had carried for years without naming. Watching Daniel from across the table, Victoria understood that leadership did not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it waited, and sometimes it wore a hoodie and held a child's hand through the dark. The night had stripped away her illusions of control and replaced them with something quieter and far more powerful perspective. As the terminal lights dimmed and the last announcements echoed overhead, she knew that whatever happened next, whatever deals were delayed or restructured, she would never again confuse importance with visibility or power with worth. Morning arrived softly at the airport hotel, sunlight filtering through thin curtains and replacing the chaos of the night with an unfamiliar calm. Victoria Reynolds stood outside Daniel Brooks' door, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate and 1 black coffee, unsure why her hands felt nervous for the first time in years. When the door opened, Emily's face lit up with instant recognition, her fear from the night before replaced by excitement and trust. Daniel thanked Victoria quietly, stepping aside so Emily could accept the drink like a small victory earned. Nothing about the moment felt transactional. It felt human. They sat together in the small breakfast area, the hum of departing planes now comforting rather than threatening. Emily pulled another paper airplane from her backpack and handed it to Victoria with ceremonial seriousness. "This one is for when you have scary days," she said. Victoria accepted it as if it were fragile glass, noticing the careful folds, the patience behind each crease. She asked Emily to teach her how to make a better one, and for the first time in her adult life, she followed instructions without trying to improve them. Daniel watched silently, seeing not a CEO, but a woman, learning how to slow down. As they talked, Daniel spoke of choices rather than achievements. Leaving the cockpit, he explained, had been the hardest decision of his life, but staying present for his daughter had become his most important mission. There was no regret in his voice, only clarity. Victoria listened, recognizing the echo of a truth she had avoided for years. She admitted that she had measured her worth in valuations and headlines flying higher and higher while losing sight of the ground. Saying it aloud felt like releasing ballast she had carried alone. Later, they walked to a grassy area near a secondary runway, the morning air crisp and clean. Emily launched her paper airplane with confidence, watching it glide smoothly before landing. Victoria tried next. Her plane wobbled but stayed airborne long enough to earn applause. Emily beamed, declaring progress. Daniel smiled, and Victoria felt something settle into place. She apologized again this time, not for a comment, but for a way of seeing. Emily considered this carefully before answering. "Daddy says airplanes can't be judged on the ground," she said. "You have to see how they fly." On the rescheduled flight home, Emily insisted on sitting between them, her paper airplane spread across the tray tables. As the plane lifted into the sky, Victoria realized she was no longer afraid. She had learned the best pilots do not chase altitude. They choose the height that keeps everyone safe and brings them home, together, safely. From a professional perspective on leadership and human behavior, this story is not really about an emergency flight. It is about how easily we misjudge value. Research in psychology shows that people rely heavily on surface cues, status, clothing, job titles to assess competence. Yet, in real crises, those signals collapse. True capability reveals itself through calm decision-making, emotional regulation, and responsibility under pressure. Daniel never sought authority, recognition, or praise. His leadership emerged naturally because it was rooted in skill, experience, and purpose. Victoria's transformation is equally important. She did not change because she was embarrassed, but because she gained clarity. She learned that power without perspective is fragile, and success without humanity is incomplete. This is how real growth happens, not through applause, but through insight. Not through dominance, but through accountability. When people choose competence over ego and people over profit, outcomes change in lasting ways. That is the kind of leadership that stabilizes systems, teams, families, and even lives. If stories like this remind you that quiet strength still exists in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to stay connected to more meaningful journeys like this one. And if this story resonated with you, leave a comment with just 2 words: quiet strength.